Today, I'm going to do an esoteric decoding and analysis of the Flash movie. This movie really seems to be some kind of meta statement about what the actor himself is going through, which many movies are. Many movies that we see are some strange reflection of what the actual actor is going through. You can see this with Jim Carrey and with certain Tom Cruise movies. So for this movie, it's with Ezra Miller. And basically, being the Flash to Ezra Miller represents being a powerful and influential celebrity. Symbolically, Ezra Miller being the Flash represents him being famous. And this power, this influence is represented by his flash ring, which Ezra Miller also often wears in real life. And he's wearing it throughout the movie. That's where he holds his costume, which also doesn't really make much sense if you think about it, because then it would obviously be a clue to show that, hey, this guy is the Flash. It also seems related to Ezra Miller, the fact that at some point in the movie, he wears women's clothes. He makes a few sexualized innuendo-type jokes, which does seem very out of character with superheroes, because generally superheroes are at essence meant to be for kids. The idea of the Flash's ring representing power harkens back to the Lord of the Rings, which is the same idea, which is that power corrupts. The desire for power corrupts. Even if somebody wants to use it with good intentions, ultimately it's very tricky not to fall into this trap of self-righteousness and self-delusion, leading one exactly the opposite way of where their soul should be going. So you could say that the future Flash is just like Gollum. That's what happens to your soul when it gets corrupted by the having and use of power. So when we see the future Flash as a monster, that's not so much his outer self, that's representing what does his inner soul look like. Same with Gollum. So that lightning bolt, the Flash symbol, represents power. And this is something you can see in many different cultures. In order to be able to use the power appropriately, he has to make the right decision. It seems like the character of Barry Allen, the Flash, and Ezra Miller, they seem to have a certain insecurity, a certain weakness, and I find that you can really hear this in his voice. It lacks power, it lacks assuredness, it lacks certainty. It seems very unsure of itself. It's high-pitched, it wavers. Many of things that he says seems to end in a question, again, emphasizing how unsure he is. And he's a character that has a lot of anxiety because essentially he's unable to accept the dark things that have happened to him in his life. He's unable to accept the darkness. He's unable to learn and come to terms with the darkness. Him being unable to come to terms with the darkness is why he's split into two different Flashes. The other Flash, his younger self, represents his dark side. And again, he is not at heart an evil person, but he is a confused person. He's a disturbed, and he's got this unhealed trauma from the passing of his mother, a darkness which he's unable to accept, causing him to react in an unenlightened way. This acting out of ignorance and darkness is what leads him to change reality, which is really changing reality in his own mind, because he cannot handle the truth Thus, we have these two flashes because he is experiencing cognitive dissonance. He cannot handle the truth. He cannot find the deeper meaning within the darkness. So that's why we have the two flashes. We have the main one, the older one, who looks normal. And then we have the other Flash, whose costume is made from Batman's costume, and it is like a distorted mirror version of the Flash. So it's the Flash's dark side. It's his ignorant side, his unenlightened, unhealed self. What he realizes from being in the speed dimension, in that multi-dimensional inter area, is that by following the dark path, he eventually will become a monster and strongly stray from his true self, his true purpose, his higher self, his loving self. For Flash, he would eventually become a monster. And then you see the reality that his other self, his younger self, inhabits. It's in a darker reality. So what do we see? We see Supergirl, but she's not like Superman. She's not as heroic. And in the end, she doesn't have the light that is able to defeat the darkness of Zod. Batman's role in this is that he is Barry's teacher, he's Barry's mentor, but more than that, he is Barry's healer. Batman is Barry's shaman. Batman is Barry's guide through the darkness. That's what Batman's purpose is. He helps those lost in the metaphorical spiritual darkness back to reality, back to truth, back to the light. And Batman is ideally suited to this because he is that one in the DC universe that has truly conquered his dark side, has truly conquered fear. In many ways, you could say he's actually stronger than Batman. But this is an inner strength. It's a spiritual, emotional, mental strength. It's a spiritual, emotional, mental strength that he developed by facing one of the darkest experiences that someone could ever face. All of this movie is essentially happening within his own mind. There's even a quote from the director who said that the special effects of the movie, they seem a bit strange. And he said the idea is that everything that we're seeing is coming from Flash's perspective, which shows that this is all an internal struggle within his own mind of whether or not to do the right thing. It was interesting in this movie, the spaghetti metaphor as related with time. And one of the most interesting notes is that Michael Keaton as Batman was saying where the noodles touch each other, those are events that cannot be changed. And we saw a similar idea in the new Spider-Man movie, which essentially had many of the same story ideas, which is that you cannot just go change things in the space-time continuum without there being some kind of repercussion, some kind of consequence. This idea of not being able to alter or change certain moments indicates the idea of a higher power, a higher destiny, some kind of higher plan where things are meant to happen in a certain way, things are guided to happen in the best way possible. In other words, things happen for a reason, and that reason is meaningful, deeply meaningful. One might say that the multiverse nexus that Flash enters is essentially the collective consciousness of humanity, with every single infinite thing from imagination able to exist. So even though the Superman movie with Nicolas Cage only exists as an idea, it never got made, in the collective consciousness, it can exist because it is a dimension of imagination where literally anything is possible. We see Christopher Reeve in the multiverse, and in the first Superman movie, he also turns back time in order to save the world, just like Flash must do in this movie. There's a scene where Batman is talking to Barry, giving him advice, and what we see behind Batman is a neon sign depicting Saturn. If you know anything about astrology, you know that there is something called a Saturn Return, which is essentially when you're 1 Saturn year old. Saturn takes 29 and a half years to go around the zodiac. So when you approach the age of 29 and a half, you experience what's called a Saturn Return, which is a time where most people step into their adult roles in life. It is a time where karma can come back to you, which is why I believe there are so many celebrities that end up passing away around the age of 27 to 30, because the Lord of Karma, Saturn, has come calling, and that means reaping what you have sown. If you haven't done the proper soul work, if you haven't lived your life in a way that's progressing, perhaps you won't make it through that Saturn return. And interestingly enough, I looked up Ezra Miller's age, and he is exactly 30 years old. He has just gone through his Saturn return, and it's time for him to really step into his role in this world, doing what he's meant to be doing, whatever that is. In the end, Barry's soul, Barry's consciousness, whatever you want to call it, decides to accept the truth, to accept the dark side of reality, to see the deeper meaning in it. His soul decides to go back to the light. And that is indeed the mark of a true hero.